The Union war effort created a new American nation-state with greatly expanded powers and responsibilities. The United States remained a federal republic, with sovereignty divided between state and national governments. Yet the war inaugurated a new national self-consciousness as indicated by a greater use of the word nation, a unified political entity rather than the older union of individual states. More and more, Americans thought freedom required a nation and coherent national identity. The war changed religion as well. Northern Protestant clergy tried to give a war a religious justification and sanctify the sacrifices of Northern soldiers. In their sermons, they joined Christianity and patriotism into a civic religion, marking the war as God's means of eradicating slavery and truly making America a land of liberty. Religion also enabled Americans to cope with the horrors of the battlefield and the enormous loss of life caused by the conflict. Intensified Northern nationalism made criticism of the war or Lincoln's administration seem treasonous to Republicans. Thousands of opposition newspaper editors, Democratic politicians, opponents of enlistment and the draft, and ordinary civilians were arrested, often arbitrarily. As the Constitution did not clarify who had the authority to suspend habeas corpus, Lincoln claimed this right under his presidential war powers, and he suspended it twice for those charged with disloyal activities. Courts generally gave the administration a free hand, and Lincoln even ignored the Supreme Court decisions in individual cases. Only in 1866 did the Supreme Court declare it unconstitutional to bring accused persons before military tribunals where civil courts were in operation. While Lincoln was no dictator, the conflict showed that civil liberties were fragile in wartime. The Northern war effort empowered both the federal government and a rising class of capitalist businessmen. Unlike the South, which was economically devastated, the Northern economy flourished. Industrial profits soared from wartime inflation and government contracts to produce supplies, coals, and iron. Mechanization was spurred onward by war demands in boot and shoe production and meat packing. Agricultural production also expanded during the war. The Northern government was committed to rapid economic growth and development, and Congress adopted policies that promoted this and transformed America's financial system. With no South represented in Congress to block changes, lawmakers adopted policies advocated by many in the North. The Homestead Act spurred agricultural development by offering 160 acres of free public land to settlers in the West. The Land Grant College Act helped states establish agricultural and mechanical schools, many of which became the state universities of today. Congress also made huge grants of money and land for internal improvements, including up to 100 million acres to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific to build the Transcontinental Railroad. This monumental project required 20,000 men to lay track, an enterprise that involved many Chinese contract laborers, called coolies by Americans. The Transcontinental Railroad, finished in 1869, expanded the national market, facilitated Western settlement and investment, and sealed the fate of Indians in the West. Because Lincoln removed soldiers from the West to fight in the East, soldiers could not keep white settlers from intruding on Indian territories. Conflict between whites and federal troops and the Indians increased. Sioux attacks on white farmers in Minnesota led to the sentencing and mass hanging of 38 Indians, the largest official execution in American history. In 1864, Colorado soldiers killed around 400 Arapaho and Cheyenne men, women, and children at Sand Creek. The Union Army also launched a campaign against the Navajo in the Southwest and forced them onto a reservation. The Confederacy ironically treated Indians more fairly than the Union, allowing tribes to elect representatives to its Congress and allowing Indian tribes on reservations complete self-government. For many Northern women, the war created economic opportunity. Women took manufacturing jobs and jobs in male professions like nursing. Women found jobs as clerks in the expanding federal government. Women maintained a presence after the war in white-collar government jobs, retail sales, and nursing. Women worked as nurses in the armies, and hundreds of thousands of women indirectly supported the armies by raising money and supplies for soldiers and freed slaves. The U.S. Sanitary Commission became a centralized national relief agency to coordinate efforts on the home front. These activities brought women into the public sphere in new ways. The suffrage movement suspended its work during the conflict, but women's contribution to the war effort heightened the sense of many women that they deserved the vote in its aftermath. The need to generate revenue to pay for the war transformed America's financial system. To raise funds, the government increased the tariff to record levels, imposed new taxes on production and consumption, and passed the first income tax in American history. The Union government also borrowed more than $2 billion by selling interest-bearing bonds, creating a huge national debt. It also printed more than $400 million of paper money called greenbacks as legal tender. Congress rationalized banking by creating a system of nationally chartered banks required to buy government bonds and allowed to issue banknotes as currency. A heavy tax drove money issued by state banks out of circulation. The United States, with a money supply before the war, an anarchic mix of paper notes issued by state and local banks during the war, had two kinds of national paper money: greenbacks, printed by the federal government, and notes issued by new national banks. Wartime economic policies handsomely benefited Northern manufacturers, railroad businessmen, and financiers. Many captains of industry of the Gilded Age made their fortunes in the war, including iron and steel man Andrew Carnegie, oil magnate John D. Rockefeller, financiers Jay Gould and J.P. Morgan, and Philip D. Armour, beef slaughterer. As a whole, Union economic policies vastly expanded the power and size of the federal government. The federal budget in 1865 was more than $1 billion, 20 times larger than 1860, and the federal government became the nation's largest employer. The war and Lincoln's policies divided the North. Republicans called those opposing the war copperheads after a poisonous snake that strikes without warning. Increasing casualties and rapid social change caused internal conflict. States with a large southern-born population, like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and cities with large working-class Catholic immigrant populations were at the center of this disquiet. The growing power of the federal government challenged local autonomy, most notably in the draft law, which allowed individuals to provide a substitute or pay a fee to escape service. Wage earners resented the huge profits of manufacturers and financiers while inflation eroded their pay. The war saw the rebirth of the Northern labor movement, which many called strikes. Prospective changes in the status of blacks sparked a racist backlash in much of the North. Although divided between anti-war and pro-war wings, the Democratic Party criticized Lincoln's policies and the draft. Occasionally, dissent became violence, most notably the July 1863 riots against the draft in New York City, in which a mostly Irish immigrant mob attacked draft offices, the mansions of wealthy Republicans, industrial establishments, and city blacks. More than 100 people were killed before federal troops ended the tumult. Confederate President Jefferson Davis proved unable to rally the Southern public behind the war. Although elegant, Davis, a West Point graduate, senator, and Mississippi plantation owner, lacked charisma and an ability to connect with ordinary citizens. The Confederacy's lack of a party system also was a liability, as Southern leaders saw parties as a danger to national unity. Davis thus lacked a counterpart to the well-organized Republican Party, which organized support for Lincoln's administration. Under Davis, the South's government became very centralized, raising armies, taking control of railroads, and building factories. But the Confederate government never effectively utilized the South's main economic resource, cotton. A strategy to focus on food production as a means to compel Great Britain, whose mills used Southern cotton, to side with the Confederacy failed. Other nations increased their cotton production, such as Egypt and India, which helped produce a crisis of overproduction after the war when Southern cotton production resumed.